Welcome. Thank you so much for coming out today. I'm Robin Morris, the Director of National Programs. Thank you, Jim. Before I do the formal introduction, I do have a little bit of housekeeping and town hall news for you. The big news is that our spring season is finalized. It's packed with programs. We have 3 programs this week alone, including tomorrow is our kickoff event for the American Constitution Society, Federalist Society debates in Washington. And then Thursday, we're doing a film screening on the Freedom Riders, followed by a short discussion. The program is free and includes access to Creating Camelot, so it might be worth coming out. Next week, if you're in New York City, we have our next Intelligence Squared debate, which asks, has the president exceeded his constitutional authority by waging war without congressional authorization? So I encourage you, because we have about 20 more programs this spring, to pick up a copy of our spring mailer if you didn't get one in the mail last week. And the programs are on the web, so sign up soon. As always, we'll be taking a few audience questions. You can jot them down on a note card, and we'll sweep through and pick them up a couple times. And lastly, I ask you to silence your cell phones. Now it's my honor to welcome Charles Slack and Mike Quinn. Charles Slack is a former journalist and an award-winning author of several books, including Hetty, which is based on the life of Wall Street pioneer Hetty Green. The book won the 2005 Connecticut State Book Award for Biography and the Elle Magazine Reader Prize for Biography. He's also the author of Noble Obsession, which was based on the life of inventor Charles Goodyear. That book won the New York Public Library 25 Best Books to Remember for 2002. We are thrilled that he's joining us today to talk about his latest book, Liberty's First Crisis, Adams, Jefferson, and the Misfits Who Saved Free Speech, which is an accessible, great book, and I encourage you to pick up a copy before you leave. Charles is signing copies outside the museum store. Our moderator today is our neighbor, Mr. Mike Quinn. He is the president and CEO of the Museum of the American Revolution. He's been there since 2012. Previously, he served as president and CEO of James Madison's Montpelier in Central Virginia for 12 years. During his tenure, he transformed Montpelier from a private estate into a premier historic home with a vibrant educational center. Prior to his service at Montpelier, Mr. Quinn served as deputy director at George Washington's Mount Vernon. So if you walked at 2nd and Chestnut Street, and many of you maybe have seen this, the block is being transformed as the Museum of the American Revolution is being built. It's a pleasure to welcome him back to the center today, and please join me in welcoming Charles Slack and Mike Quinn.
Thank you very much. I'm Mike Quinn, by the way. This is Charles.
I'm Charlie.
Charlie, okay. What a pleasure to be here and to have so many people here for this discussion. And it's an honor to be here, and my thanks to the Constitution Center.
It's a real honor for me to be here. This is a wonderful
And let's just plunge right into the book. Let me start out, by the way, however, with a little commercial, which is, this is one of the best history books I've read in a long time. I cannot urge you more strongly to buy this and read it. We're going to cover as much as we can, but we're just going to skim the surface. That's all you can do. But this is a great read. If you don't buy it, you will regret it. And not just because it's a good read, because it is so relevant to today's world. And we'll try and explain all of that to you as we go. Now, if you will sort of reach back into the far reaches of your memory when you were in high school, I'm sure you learned about the Alien and Sedition Acts. Well, guess what? It's not one act, it's 2. And this book is about just one of them, the Sedition Act. And I think we ought to start out by asking Charlie to tell us, what is sedition and how did this act come about?
Well, sedition is defined as speech that incites rebellion against the government. And the Sedition Act of 1798 came about during a time of real crisis. It was 7 years after we'd passed the Bill of Rights. Of the idealism with which the country had been founded had sort of fallen away into this time of crisis. We were on the verge of war with France. The country had sort of divided. I think At the time, at the start of the country, I think George Washington and others had kind of had this idea that the government would be a unified body, that people would have their debates. When they elected people, then the elected leaders would take office and represent all the people. So the idea that there would be parties, the term party was an epithet, sort of like faction, as somebody who was wanting to sort of subvert the goodwill of the people of the United States.
So we're just starting to see parties develop, which means you've got strong, intense, opposing viewpoints, kind of sorting people out a little bit.
Yes, and you had two groups, the Federalists, who controlled the presidency and Congress and the Supreme Court, who saw themselves as sort of the moral leaders of the country and believed in a strong national government. Then on the other side, you had this sort of emerging group called the Democratic Republicans, which I always love using that term. The Republicans, anti-federalists, who believed sort of were more skeptical of the large national government. So the divisions were becoming acute. The rancor was becoming louder on a daily basis. The Republicans were using the newspapers to sharply criticize the Federalists. The Federalists didn't like it. They held the belief that to criticize them was to criticize the United States, to call into question the United States. So they passed the Sedition Act of 1798 to try to silence by imposing fines and prison sentences for speech that criticized government officials.
And it is amazing to think 1798, I mean, this is within a decade of the passage of the Bill of Rights. How could that be? That seems so contradictory to do that within the same decade. I mean, the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, is very explicit about freedom of speech.
Congress shall make no law.
Right.
Here was a law. Right. I think that what happened, the country was unified. The American people had been unified in the idea that they wanted to be free. They wanted their own freedom. And as long as the enemy was the controlling British authorities, it was pretty easy to be unified around the idea of freedom. What hadn't really been determined, there was no way to know this yet, was how that would play out in practical reality. And so when the Federalists got into power and suddenly the criticism was coming at them, not at the British, I think they felt that this was an assault on the United States. And the United States was
Charles, one
yes.
point of clarification. When you say the Federalist, who's the president at this time?
Oh, excuse me, John Adams was the president.
And so he is viewed as a strong, clear Federalist, right?
Absolutely, yes. And the Congress was Federalist controlled, and the Supreme Court was as well.
And so you're saying we're really at a time where we're kind of discovering what these words actually mean. And it was one thing when we're all unified in arms against British oppression, but now we've got dissension in our own ranks, so to speak.
Exactly, and you have John Adams suddenly caught in a pincher between the hawkish side of his Federalist Party, who wants him to go to war with France. You've got the Republican journalists assailing him, Adams as a warmonger, and Adams caught in the middle in a very precarious spot. And you can sort of see, I mean, it's not hard to see the motivation when you see these sort of scurrilous items being published in the paper all the time. These things were making it very difficult for Adams and Congress to govern, and they felt that it was putting the country in danger.
And these things in the paper, were they as vitriolic as what we see in today's papers?
I think in a lot of ways more so. I always love to see references to the need to return to the more civil era of journalism, because it was scurrilous. There was a lot rumor and calling Adams a royalist, a monarchist, because for accusing him of trying to install a British-style monarchy and consolidate power. The thing was about the Sedition Act was you had scurrilous things being said on both sides, but of course the Federalists were in power, so only one side got arrested.
Got it. Okay. Another great aspect of this book, and we're going to keep moving here, is the characterization of the people involved. They are so colorful, they hardly seem real. And these are the men who played main roles as the Sedition Act played out. And one of them, who I did not know of before, is Matthew Lyon. And I guess let's start out by saying his rise to power might well be called an unintended cause of the American democracy. So you want to tell us about Matthew Lyon?
Yeah, Matthew Lyon was absolutely one of my favorite characters to look into. Matthew Lyon had come over to the United States at the age of 14 as an indentured servant. And his indenture was traded from time to time. At one point, he was his current owner of his indenture traded him for a pair of bulls, which was something that his enemies, he was sort of proud of that for his whole life, but anybody who raised it against him, that was fighting words. And he went to, he found Connecticut to be, even in the late 18th century, to be a bit too confining. So as soon as he was released from his indenture, he went up to the wilds of Vermont, and he fought in the Revolutionary War, founded a business empire after the war, ran a newspaper, got himself elected to Congress, and he came down from the wilds of Vermont to Philadelphia in 1797 to serve in Congress. He was ill-educated, kind of a street-fighting person. At that time, immigration, it's funny, you go back to 1798 and you can see people saying the same things about immigration, the same debates going on then as are going on now. Immigration's great, but the country's getting too crowded. This is 1798. A congressman from Massachusetts, Harrison Gray Otis, gave what is known as the wild Irish speech. Irish immigrants in particular and German were alarming to the Federalists. And Harrison Gray Otis gave a speech in which he warned about hordes of wild Irishmen invading our shores. Well, here was Matthew Lyon, a wild Irishman, not just invading our shores, but invading Congress. And he became quite the lightning rod. He refused to back down from anybody. He refused to participate in ceremonies honoring John Adams because he felt they smacked of monarchy and royalism. He was engaged in a fist fight on the House floor.
Unbelievable.
There we go with more civility of the old days. Ultimately, he was arrested while campaigning for re-election. He was the first person to be formally arrested under this new Sedition Act because he had published a letter to the editor of a Vermont newspaper criticizing Adams, and he had given campaign speeches in which he had quoted Joel Barlow, a Connecticut poet and diplomat, as saying that John Adams belonged in a madhouse. And for that, he was arrested.
And you know, I think I want to pause here, interrupt.
Yeah,
if I
sure.
can. I just think this is so stunning that if the idea of the Sedition Act is, you know, let's not have people criticize the government, yet the first application is a sitting member of Congress.
Exactly.
I mean, if nothing else, that starts to tell you how really oppressive this kind of law could be.
Well, it converts, the problem with laws of this nature is that they convert freedom, liberty, individual rights, the right to free speech, from a right into a political privilege. And that's exactly what happened, because you could be arrested for assailing a Federalist member of Congress or John Adams, but Matthew Lyon was routinely assailed on the street and harassed and called all kinds of nasty names, but nobody arrested anybody for doing that to Matthew Lyon.
So he was arrested?
He was arrested, and he was put on trial in Rutland, Vermont, and he was convicted, sentenced to jail, thrown into a cold, drafty cell in Vergennes, Vermont, where he was attended by a kind of a sadistic jailkeeper named Jabez Fitch. And Lyon was the kind of guy that always, people liked him. He managed to draw his adherents to him that thought he was great, but he also made a lot of enemies. What the jail sentence did was it converted him from being this sort of lightning rod character into a martyr. And as he sat in jail, he became more and more popular, the legend of Matthew Lyon suffering for his free speech. And he wound up that winter in being reelected to Congress from his jail cell.
But you also
he still
found-
had to serve out. It was in December that he won re-election, and he wasn't released until February because his term wasn't up. And one interesting story, if I may, about when he was released, he was worried. He'd been publishing, he had a magazine called The Scourge of Aristocracy that his son was publishing in Vermont, keeping up the attacks on Adams and everybody. So he was concerned that he might get arrested as soon as he stepped out of jail, re-arrested for his new sedition. So he invoked the constitutional provision that says that you can't be arrested if you're a member of Congress on your way to or from government business. So that was put in the Constitution, I think, to protect against, rounding up your opponents so that they wouldn't be on hand to vote against your bill or something.
And it didn't stop there. What I found, I did think it's amazing. Your research is amazing to discover what his thoughts were and that he recorded them while he was in jail, and that again put him at risk for a second arrest. But it did not end there. When he got to Congress and took his seat in the House, what happened?
Well, he returned to Congress and took his seat, and Federalist members of Congress promptly had set about trying to have him evicted from Congress for having gotten arrested. So let's talk about a catch-22. So they didn't want to. We can't have a criminal serving, and they won the popular vote in Congress. I think it was 49 to 44 or something, but you needed a 2/3 majority. So it was the second time Matthew Lyon survived an attempt to evict him. The first time was that fist fight when he had turned and spit in Federalist Roger Griswold's face.
Now, as you read this book, you will quickly discover it not only had political implications of basically trying to suppress your political opponents, but in the field of journalism as well, because sedition can be, of course, that's, especially if you've got these strong opinions being printed, you go after the press. So one of the people mentioned in your book or described is someone known to all of us here in Philadelphia, Benjamin Beach.
That's right. Benjamin Franklin Beach, as his name implies, was closely related to Benjamin Franklin. He was his grandson. And Beach had developed a sort of a lifelong love of France, and he had gone with Benjamin Franklin at the age of 7 in 1776 on Franklin's diplomatic mission to France, and he'd soaked up a love of France and also an idealistic love of his grandfather and his grandfather's ideas and ideals about liberty. So when he came back to the United States, he was by Franklin's side at all times, was there by his bedside when he died. Benjamin Franklin left Benny, as he called him, all of his printing equipment, which turned out to sort of seal Benny's fate, because Benjamin Franklin Beach founded a newspaper called the Aurora in 1790, which quickly became a very politically oriented newspaper that really went after anybody who was in power. And I think that Beach, what he couldn't stand, he was a pure idealist. He was imbued with the ideals of his grandfather. What he couldn't stand to watch was the compromises being made. So he started out liking George Washington, and when George Washington declared neutrality in the war between England and France, and then subsequently signed the Jay Treaty, which seemed to be too favorable to the British, Benjamin Beach attacked Washington mercilessly, questioned his Revolutionary War service. When Adams came in, initially Beach was favorable to Adams, but then quickly turned on him when he felt that Adams was being too pro-English and too against the French. And Abigail Adams, very loyal to John, termed Bache a viper who needed to be stopped. And he, along with Matthew Lyon, was a great lightning rod in terms of the pushing forward the passage of the Sedition Act.
Now, you make the point that he was arrested or charged with sedition, not under federal law, but under the state common law.
Well, yes, he was arrested for under the common law for seditious libel, and I think it was because the Sedition Act hadn't been passed yet. It would be passed a month or two later, but they really wanted to try to silence Bache. He had been publishing secret government documents that he'd gotten his hands on. It was sort of a late 18th century version of WikiLeaks. They needed to do something to stop him, so they arrested him under common law seditious libel. And he, as he was awaiting trial, it was kind of tragic. It was during the summer of 1798 when the yellow fever epidemic swept through, and everybody sort of skedaddled. Everybody who could left Philadelphia. Much of the federal government picked up and moved to Trenton. Benjamin Bache stayed behind with his pregnant wife and his sons, and manning his printing press. It was really the only weapon that he had, and he contracted yellow fever and died shortly before he was going to go to trial.
And there are other journalists involved, the Argus paper in New York, the Vermont Gazette, but one of the more amazing and colorful people in journalism at the time was Thomas Callender.
Yes.
So why don't you just tell us a little bit about
Sure, Callender,
his role under the Sedition Act?
James Thompson Callender was a Scottish journalist who, sort of a thread running through the people who were persecuted for sedition. They didn't like authority. There was something about them that rebelled against power. And Callender, growing up in Scotland as a young writer, had lashed out at the British. He'd lashed out at Samuel Johnson, of all people, because he felt Johnson wasn't sufficiently respectful of the Scottish, so he wrote a book taking apart Samuel Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language. He came over to the United States when he had angered the British and came here and started doing the same thing in the United States, writing scathing articles, taking on the powerful. One of his primary enemies was Alexander Hamilton. He was the guy who exposed Hamilton's extramarital affair with Maria Reynolds, and he was a particular lightning rod and ultimately became a victim of the Sedition Act.
And in fact, talking about it, one question you're going to have, which I had, is where's the Supreme Court in this? I mean, we always think nowadays the Supreme Court steps in and will rule laws unconstitutional. So where was the Supreme Court? Why wasn't it taking that role? And maybe in that you can introduce another colorful character, Samuel Chase.
Yes, the short answer to where was the Supreme Court is they were actively involved, sitting in on the trials, presiding over these sort of unjust trials that convicted the defendants in the Sedition Act. As you point out, the process or the role of the Supreme Court as the judicial review and determining the constitutionality of laws had yet to be established. That wouldn't come until 1803 and the Marbury versus Madison case. So these justices of the Supreme Court actually rode the circuit. It was one of the reasons why a lot of people didn't want to be on the Supreme Court, because the travel was arduous. They traveled the country actually serving on presiding over cases, and several Supreme Court justices actually presided over Sedition Act cases in which people were convicted.
And I found Samuel Chase amazing because he seemed to, not only was he riding the circuit, it seems like he drew his circuit to connect the dots between all these sedition cases. Because he...
Chase was known as Old Bacon Face. I think he had sort of a ruddy complexion, but he was a staunch Federalist. He had no doubt in his mind that these people who were being tried absolutely had to be convicted. The the Sedition Act had provided sort of an out for defendants that they could get off, they could use as a defense that what they said was true, but the burden was on them to prove the veracity of what they'd said. It wasn't on the state to prove that they had lied. And what we were dealing with in most cases was opinions. So you try to prove the truth or falsehood of your opinions. That's where the defendants found themselves in that spot. Well, Chase would sort of instruct juries in the cases that he presided over, which was really, it's not up to you, the jury, to decide whether this is a good law or a bad law. All the prosecution needs to prove is whether the person said or wrote what he's charged with saying or writing.
And then it becomes the defendant's job to prove that it was truthful or factual.
Exactly. So, but in the cases, it was manifestly clear that the person had actually said or written what they were charged with saying or writing. So these were just sort of kangaroo courts. They were just open and shut cases. And
we've talked about effect on politicians, effect on the journalist. However, it didn't stop there. You bring to light a really interesting guy because he's so regular, a man named Luther Baldwin. Tell us how he ended up.
Luther Baldwin is one of my
captured by-
favorite characters in the book, and I think that he serves a great example of how a law like the Sedition Act, which is intended to go after a few political figures or a few opponents, can actually reach its icy fingers down into the populace very quickly. Luther wasn't a politician or a writer. He was a waterman. He had a small boat, and he plied the waters in and around Newark, New Jersey. He had gone out drinking with some friends on one morning, and it so happened, it was in the summer of 1798, John Adams and Abigail were on their way from Philadelphia to Massachusetts. As they passed through Newark, as anywhere the presidential carriage went, a crowd was out to greet them. Now, Luther wasn't a big fan of the presidents. He was drunk. He was approaching another bar when the carriage went through, and some admirers of Adams set off a cannon salute. And one of Luther's friends said, "Oh, pardon my language, oh, they're shooting at his ass." And Luther said, "I don't care if they shoot through his ass." And that was his response. And the bar owner who had stepped outside to see the parade was an admirer of Adams, and turned to Luther and said, "That's sedition." And so this was a case, this became an ordeal for Luther Baldwin that went on for the better part of, for well over a year. There was a prosecutor named Lucius Horatio Stockton who was looking to make a good name for himself with Adams and figured this was his case. So he hounded Luther Baldwin for over a year with the charge that he had wickedly and maliciously and seditiously and many other ways slandered not just Adams but the United States of America. And Luther's case is often, as I say, since he wasn't a thinker, he wasn't a politician or a writer, he's often been called comic relief, that he was a sort of a comic footnote in the case. And in doing some research on him and using America's historical newspapers and some other resources, I sort of built out a bit about the story of his life, kind of a colorful character. He sort of worked as a spy during the Revolutionary War and had some interesting elements to him. But really the case told me I don't think it is just comic relief. As I say, I think it's vital because when a law like this gets passed, if you're not free to make a dumb offhand comment on a street corner, freedom is really imperiled.
Exactly. This also, an interesting element that we've talked already about, these are the early days of our republic when the roles assigned to political institutions like the Supreme Court just haven't been defined yet. We're still working it out. An amazing thing did happen. All of these laws, all of these convictions and cases were noticed and really did start creating reaction against it and protest. And two individuals who are very important in history, James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, took fairly unusual steps in response. Why don't you talk about that? Because it kind of lays the seed for so much later chapters in our history.
Sure. I don't know how many people are familiar with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. These were written in late 1798, and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison authored them. As we talked about a little bit before, there really wasn't a mechanism for judicial review of a law, whether it was a good or bad law. So what did you do when Congress passed something that you think is unconstitutional, that endangers liberty, that's going the wrong way? How do we respond? Well, Thomas Jefferson, who interestingly was a member of Adams' cabinet as vice president at the time. At that time, if you come in second, you're vice president. So he was been sort of working to try to subvert the Sedition Act, and one thing he did was he marshaled Madison, who was in retirement in Montpelier, to leap back into the fray. And Jefferson wrote the Kentucky Resolution, and Madison wrote the Virginia Resolution. And what these did was represented the state government opinion that that Congress has seriously erred here in passing the Sedition Act. And the threat, the veiled threat, was that if you continue with this and you keep wrong-headed measures like this, we don't have to stay in the in the government.
Yeah, and you think about it. You think about how the nation was created through the Constitutional Convention. It really was the states creating a union. So you can sort of see the logic of them saying, well, the state is still a major stakeholder in this union and has a voice in whether it's living up to that Constitution we ratified just 10, 11 years before.
Absolutely. And of the two documents, Jefferson wrote the Kentucky Resolution. It was notably darker, more ominous. It sort of started off with, we don't have to be part of the Union if this kind of stuff goes on. Madison's was more sort of optimistic. His was framed as look, it's our job as states to correct the federal government when it makes mistakes of this nature. But both of them sort of set the stage for what became known as nullification, the idea that you can invalidate laws and that states can, and ultimately Jefferson's name, one hopes Jefferson would have strongly disapproved of this, but in the years leading up to the Civil War, some southern states used the Kentucky Resolution in particular as sort of a pretext for the ability to withdraw from the Union if you disagree.
Yeah, so there were two things in those resolutions. One, the state saying, we think this is an unconstitutional law, but as you say, that then starts getting close to this boundary of saying, well, it isn't going to be enforced in our state, and then the ultimate step of saying, we are so offended, we're going to pull out of the Union.
Right.
So it really does kind of lay the seeds of the nullification, the idea of the Southern Confederacy, and it was pointed to as authority for secession from the Union.
Absolutely.
Now, let me bring up something else too, which is just the incredible amount of research you did in this book. By the way, before I get there, I don't want to leave you entirely hanging. So we've got this law, we've got politicians, journalists, average guys making offhand, crude comments, all being caught up under the Sedition Act. So how did it, we know we don't have a Sedition Act today, it's gone away, so how did it come to an end?
Well, that's a great question. So how did the Sedition Act end? The Federalists had been very smart about, or crafty about, the way they wrote the law and put it into action. They timed it to disappear at the end of their term in 1801, in March 3rd, 1801, the last day of their term and of the John Adams presidency, with the idea, I think, that if they were to be thrown out of office, which is what happened, partly because of the Sedition Act, that there would be no law under which they might be charged with sedition, and it would be easy enough to sort of reinstate it if they thought it had been doing a a good job. So it sort of quietly faded away, and the Republicans, the Jefferson administration made no effort to reinstall it. Interestingly, in World War I, we had the Sedition Act of 1918, which you sort of wonder, were people learning from history, where the nation became fearful of, we were at war, and some people were speaking out against the draft and against the war effort, and so along comes the new Sedition Act, and we're at it all over again, where several hundred people were tried under the Sedition Act of 1918, along with the Espionage Act of 1917, which made it illegal to speak out against the war, and a lot of people went to jail, and that law actually had to be repealed.
And you make an excellent point there, Charlie. I mean, as a journalist yourself, part of what you do in your book is really connect this to today's world. And I think it's important because it's one of our valuable freedoms that keep this country free. And you point out that we shouldn't think that we'll never again go down that road. I mean, you even point to some suggestions that it's happening again.
Well, I think it's something that free speech, this was sort of, the Sedition Act was the first great hurdle. It's very important because it was the first test of, are we going to live by these glorious words that we've written into our Bill of Rights, or are we going to do like everybody else in history, which is get in power and start rounding up the usual suspects? And we passed that test in 1798, but it doesn't mean that we don't face that every generation. I think every generation has had to face its own free speech issues. I mentioned 1918. You look at the McCarthy era and on up through modern times. And I think that today, I don't think it's a partisan right or left thing necessarily. It's more the idea that it's very easy to assume that what other people are saying is truly dangerous. And look, if all we have to do is silence those people, it won't infringe liberty because these guys are lunatics. Will actually enhance freedom if we just shut up these obnoxious voices. Well, the problem is that if you go through history and at every point shut up those obnoxious voices, the band of people who are actually allowed to speak, I think, narrows. And today you have, I think, what I call, well, first of all, around the world, there are actual sedition laws all over the place. If you click like on an email that is critical of the King of Thailand, you can get thrown in jail, and that's just one example all over the world. And in this country, I think the First Amendment has done a really good job of giving us a mechanism to check against infringements on liberty. But there's no shortage of people calling for shutting up people that we see as dangerous. And we also see,
if I can jump in, I think that's a good point because, if you think in current events today, the concern about policing in places like Ferguson, there was a big front page article in today's Inquirer about the Justice Report on policing here in Philadelphia. Part of this issue is inflammatory speech. Do we really, it can lead to problems. What are we going to do about this? Should we do something about it? And this starts shifting the standard, as a point you make in your book.
Yeah, I think that that if we decide, the cases where your words put somebody in imminent harm, or you can't, I think the underlying idea is you can't use your freedom to directly steal somebody else's freedom.
I can't say there's a fire in a theater.
You've got the fire in the crowded theater. You
Standard
can't
example.
call up an assassin and make arrangements to kill an enemy, and then that happens and you say, I was just talking. You can't use your freedom to move around, to go into your neighbor's house and steal the television set. It's those points. And these are very complicated fine lines. Where do rights clash? Where is there a direct, your use of your free speech
But if
robs
I start
mine?
saying
But if where that line can't be is, did what you say give me great offense?
Sure. That I criticize your heritage.
Right, even deep offense, because what happens when you decide that giving offense is actionable, you really destroy liberty, because what you do is you take freedom out of the hands. It's no longer the right of the speaker, it's the right of the listener. And the bar is not, this is what I want to say, this is my belief, even if you find it offensive. It's, did I find that offensive? And when you put that into place, really speech becomes a political privilege rather than a right. When that right transfers from the speaker to the listener, and then it's really, do you have political cover or not? Do the people in power side with you or side with your opponents? That's what we saw in the Sedition Act of 1798, and I think that's what we would see today.
And I think that's kind of a great kind of culminating statement of the real importance of the history you've brought out in this book. And I do want to add one point. Throughout, I was so impressed with the research you did to find out what Matthew Lyon was thinking in jail, to see the number report of petitions to Congress protesting the Sedition Act. I want to compliment you on your research, but also on really organizing and sifting through that to make just a powerful narrative.
Well, thank you. And it's amazing the amount of things you can find online these days for research. I mentioned America's Historical Research, newspapers, the Annals of Congress, and all of these things. But there's no substitute for actually going to places and visiting institutions. And so in Philadelphia, the American Philosophical, the National Park Library, and Sue Habgood, who is here, is a friend of mine who operates historical tours of Philadelphia, is a wonderful proponent of Philadelphia, and gave me a wonderful grounding in the history. And I had lots of help through my research process.
Okay. Now I'm going to get to some questions from our audience. Thank you for whoever brought these up here. We'll start out with an historical question. Did Matthew Lyon fight Matthew Griswold? I think it was.
Yes.
Wasn't it Roger Griswold?
No, it was Roger Griswold.
Roger Griswold,
yes.
I think you mean. Did Matthew Lyon fight Roger Griswold of Lyme, Connecticut?
Yeah, Roger Griswold was a Connecticut congressman. I didn't go into this detail. I mentioned they had a fight, and if I can have a moment, because it's really a colorful story. Matthew Lyon was on the floor of Congress one day. It was during a break, and he was talking to the speaker and saying that, well, if he was in Connecticut, if he was back in Connecticut, he could whip Connecticut into shape. They don't have good representatives. The Federalists are too strong there. And Roger Griswold, who was a Connecticut Federalist, said, well, I had had enough. And he turned and he said, if you go into Connecticut, you'd better wear your wooden sword. And that was a reference to a period where, during the Revolutionary War, where Lyon had been accused of when some men under him deserted, he'd been accused of cowardice. He was exonerated, but the rumor had spread that he'd been forced to wear a wooden sword as a symbol of cowardice. So Roger Griswold said, you'd better wear a wooden sword. Lyon pretended not to hear him. Griswold got up and approached from behind and repeated the comment. Matthew Lyon, if he'd been a gentleman, he would have called for a duel at sunrise. He wasn't a gentleman. He was a street fighter. He turned and spit in Roger Griswold's face. And so everybody was stunned silence. You think Congress wastes its time today? They spent the next 2 weeks. You don't believe, going through Annals of Congress, they're still talking about this, pages and pages, about this airborne gob of saliva. They were trying to get Lyon kicked out of Congress. They failed to muster the votes to have him ejected. So Griswold figured it's time to take matters into his own hands. He walks into Congress one day carrying a stout stick. He spots Matthew Lyon, hits him over the head with the stick. Lyon makes his way to the fireplace, and this was in Congress Hall, makes his way to the fireplace, grabs a pair of fire tongs, and they go at it, and bloodied but not permanently injured. That was their great brawl.
So next time you're in Congress Hall, imagine this fight, because it really
the return to the days of civility.
Right. Another historical question. Do you think, what was Jefferson doing through all of this? This is before he was elected president. Of course, we've
talked a little bit about the Kentucky Resolution. He was, as I mentioned, he was a part of this opposition party who found himself very lonely in the Adams administration. Incidentally, I noticed that, I mentioned that the Federalists were crafty in how they wrote the Sedition Act. One thing that they did was they left out the vice presidency as being exempt from criticism. So, you couldn't criticize Congress or the president, but suspiciously, it seemed you could still criticize the vice president. Jefferson really went about kind of on the sly, trying to do everything he could to subvert the Sedition Act, and he wound up forming relationships with journalists. He was friendly with Bache, and particularly James Thompson Callender, whom he would give $50 under the table from time to time to help keep his anti-Adams writings going. So he really was doing that, and it came back to bite. His relationship with Callender came back to bite him years later. I don't have time to go too much into it, but Callender, when Jefferson was elected president, Callender assumed that he'd be in line for a public office, and Jefferson didn't want to have anything more to do with Callender because Callender was kind of a wild, unhinged alcoholic. He was a brilliant journalist, but you never knew what he was going to say or do. He wasn't the kind of person that Jefferson wanted in his administration. Didn't give him the appointment. Callender wound up exposing the Sally Hemings affair, which
he broke that story
rumored
to
for 200 years, and then sort of DNA made it seem like a lot more than a rumor in the 1990s, and so Callender's journalism lives on.
Right. Okay. And we have a number of questions about how this does relate to today's world. Do you think citing early political rancor in any way justifies the current behavior of our political leaders?
Well, I don't know how to answer that. I mean, in terms of what they say about each other, I don't know. I mean, I think that's sort of for each person to decide for him or herself what is appropriate and what's not appropriate.
Yeah, I think I would agree
discourse.
with that. Yeah.
My real point in the book is, and I really hope to not be partisan in the book, it's more about the idea that, look, let's keep fighting each other. I don't mind the rancor. I think rancor, chaos is sort of, people from other countries sometimes look at the United States and they see some nut job out there saying these crazy things and embarrassing the president or embarrassing the country, and boy, why can't they do anything about that? They must be weak. I see that as a sign of strength. I don't think there's anything wrong with rancor.
And you make the nice point in your book that in Jefferson's first inaugural address, he talks about we're all
Republicans, we're all Federalists,
right.
And he said
and he makes
specifically,
the point, we're strong. Our nation is strong enough to withstand internal debate.
And what if you have somebody saying, down with the United States? That's okay.
Right.
We can overcome it. And so I think I like the rancor. I think we need to keep it up, and we just need to commit ourselves to two things. One is, if you're deeply offended by what somebody else says, you don't take matters into your own hands and bomb them. You fight back with words, and you don't call the police.
Who was it that said the best response to bad words is truth?
Is better words. A number of
better
people.
Words, I don't have the words correctly.
Anthony Lewis was one person who said. I mean, lots of people have sort of said that one way.
Okay, would you comment on the Sons of the Confederacy versus the state of Texas, over a license plate logo? Did I get that right? So I presume what's going on here is a group wants a Confederate flag on a state license plate.
on the state license plate.
So it's a special group, or is it
I think it's I'm not an expert on this, but I think that it comes up from time to time in lots of different venues. Particularly now it's with the sort of a Confederate symbol on the license plate. Anytime where you have personalized license plates, I know it came up. I used to live in Virginia. It comes up in Virginia a lot. Where can we personalize this in a way? Can we use profanity? Can we use and I don't know. I don't know that I necessarily see that as a First Amendment issue. It's because nobody is preventing that group from flying the Confederate flag as they want to or saying what they want. It's an issue of, does the state sort of imply a sanction for it by putting it on license plates? To me, I think I can see sort of both sides in that. I mean, I don't mean to not. to cop out by not coming down hard and fast on one side or the other. But to me, more compelling would be rounding up this group, and because they had been putting out a newsletter that had the Confederate symbol on it, and arresting them or shutting down their newsletter.
I was just thinking the same thing. If you propose that logo, you're just getting denied. You're not getting thrown in jail and fined. So the state may be drawing the line. We don't look like we are sanctioning your speech, but they're doing nothing to impede it in every other.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of similar.
medium.
You see speech cases arising on campuses where, there's a recent case where fraternity brothers shouting racist things from their, allegedly, and is this, does the school, as a state-supported school, have the right to shut them down? I mean, I think that there again, I think universities as institutions are well within their rights to establish codes of conduct that you won't do things in a way that will say things that will make the university look bad, that will send the institution into disgrace.
So it's a distinction between government action versus a non-governmental.
An institution. I mean, I think in a lot of times people do confuse private censorship with the public censorship of throwing somebody into jail. It's like if a newspaper decides not to print a certain article, or they decide not to print your letter to the editor, and you cry censorship, or you cry, well, I have my First Amendment rights. You don't have any First Amendment right to be published in a newspaper. You don't have any First Amendment right to be taken seriously. You don't have any First Amendment right to be listened to. The only thing you have a First Amendment right to is to not be arrested or fined or shut down by the government.
Authority.
And that the government will step in and protect you if somebody else does that to you. If you start a newspaper and the old case of beating up the newsboys on the corner trying to pass out your newspaper because you want to consolidate your monopoly, that's where you are owed protection.
So if you are in my home and say something I find offensive, I can order you out. What I can't do is go to the police and have you arrested.
Yeah, this guy's offensive. Exactly.
Right. Is it fair to say that the U.S. has more liberty today than in the 18th and 19th centuries? And I guess let's keep this on freedom of speech.
That's a wonderful question. I think that every generation sort of thinks that it has, that it's at the precipice, that there was a time when people had less freedoms. I think we are at an we are very free today, and I think if you look back compared to the 18th century and throughout much of the 19th century, what the Supreme Court cases of the early 20th century, Oliver Wendell Holmes, his Great Dissent. There's a book, The Great Dissent by Thomas Healy, a marvelous book, sort of looking at how Justice Holmes came around to the idea of that even obnoxious speech is okay as long as it doesn't cause imminent harm and so forth. Now we have sort of the Supreme Court, I think, very solidly behind free speech and the idea that you can't be thrown in jail for ideas that merely offend. On the other hand, I think that we always need to be on guard. I think there are lots of movements today, for example, that you might get on board with philosophically to protect vulnerable groups from you have calls for hate speech laws that are all across Europe and all across in Canada, provisions that
Charlie Hebdo
that protect people, aimed at protecting people from vulnerable groups from being offended. You have people calling for that. You have people calling for what they call public freedom, or a more democratic people's freedom of speech, which would sort of elevate some voices and shut down other voices in order to improve the discourse. And these are ideas that are sort of gaining intellectual credence these days. And I think that it behooves every generation to level set and to really keep in mind what does perpetuate freedom and what is a threat to freedom. And it's why I sort of close my book by saying that every generation, to me, the greatness of every generation is measured not by how it responded to the specific crises or the laws that it passed to shut down specific threats, but the degree of wisdom it showed in looking beyond the moment and being wise enough to hand down liberty intact to the next generation.
That's an excellent point. Here's a great question that I think we have just time for, which takes us to the issue of net neutrality on the internet. How does concepts of freedom of speech translate to a means of communication that was inconceivable at the time of the Bill of Rights?
That's a great point. Well, the internet, it's easy to sort of talk about each new technological change as well. The founders never envisioned this. The founders never saw that. So, and it's usually a pretext for, individual rights, liberty, the First Amendment. Those were fine in their place, but now we really need to rethink. And I think that the internet poses all kinds of new situations where ideas can get out and there's sort of unlimited, but I think that it's
thinking back to previous technological innovations, we've had censorship on television, we've had censorship in movies, radio.
Well, one of my favorite examples that I quote in the book was Cass Sunstein, who was President Obama's chief regulatory czar. He now teaches at Harvard, and he's written on what he sees as sort of the need to kind of control speech or to rethink speech as is it doing its proper job of promoting discourse and everything. And he wrote a book in which he said, astonishing technological changes have created the new situation in which we really need to rethink free speech, and he called for what he called the New Deal for speech. Well, that book was written in 1993, and the terrific threats that he cited were newspapers and broadcasting stations. Now, we all know what happened to newspapers and broadcasting stations, and along comes the internet. So what happens if I'm sure there's, and I know that there are all kinds of people saying, well, the internet, now, the founders never, you look back at the newspapers, that was great for the First Amendment, but now this sort of unregulated, scary environment known as the internet, the founders never envisioned that. We need to clamp down now. We need to start regulating. Well, what if we do that? Who knows how people will be communicating?
It's your point about...
It's all the more important to hold on to your freedom,
right.
to hold on to your principles.
Pass it on, and what we pass on to the next generation.
Yeah.
So, well, thank you, Charlie. This has been wonderful. And again, I hope you will all read this book. I want to really thank you. I think what you've done in bringing history, making it accessible, opening up details, inspiring storylines, and of course, really colorful characters is really laudable. So thank you for
Thanks
your
so
book.
much. It's been a real honor to be here. To be here in the cradle of liberty and one of the world's great cities and talk about this has been a real joy. Thank you for having me.
And our thanks to the Constitution Center.
Yes, thank you so much to the Constitution Center.
All right. Thank you all for coming.